The Battle of Stalingrad is remembered as one of the bloodiest battles in human history, a frozen nightmare where nearly 2 million soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded, or captured. Cities had been destroyed before. Entire armies had been lost before. But Stalingrad stands apart. This was not just a defeat. It was a collapse. And while it's often described as the moment Nazi Germany began to lose the Second World War, that explanation misses something far more important. Stalingrad was not only a turning point, it was a warning of what happens when pride replaces strategy, when leaders stop listening, when symbols matter more than human lives, and when retreat becomes unthinkable, even when it is the only move left. By the summer of 1942, Germany had already failed in its original plan to destroy the Soviet Union in a single lightning campaign. Operation Barbarossa, launched with confidence and arrogance, had stalled outside Moscow the year before. The Red Army was battered, exhausted, and scarred, but it was still alive. The war in the East had become exactly what Germany never wanted, a long war of exhaustion. Hitler refused to accept that reality. Instead of regrouping or shortening his lines, he looked south. His focus shifted to oil. The Caucasus oil fields powered the Soviet war effort, and Hitler believed that if Germany could seize them, the Soviet Union would collapse from the inside. Without oil, tanks would stop, planes would stay grounded, the Red Army would slowly grind to a halt. But that plan created a dangerous problem. Germany's southern advance would stretch deep into enemy territory, leaving a long, exposed flank along the Volga River. Sitting directly on that flank was a large industrial city, packed with factories, rail lines, and river traffic. That city was Stalingrad. At first, Stalingrad was never meant to become the main objective. Militarily, it didn't need to be fully captured. It only needed to be neutralized. But Stalingrad carried something far more powerful than factories or supply routes. It carried a name tied directly to Hitler's greatest enemy. Once Hitler fixated on that name, strategy began to fade. The battle stopped being about winning the war and became about winning a symbol. And symbols, once chosen, are almost impossible to abandon. As German forces approached in late summer 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed massive bombing raids. For days, the sky burned. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Wooden houses caught fire and spread flames block by block. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, many buried alive beneath collapsing buildings. But the destruction created a fatal problem for the attackers. The ruins turned Stalingrad into a defender's paradise. Streets disappeared, maps became useless, rubble formed natural barricades, factories turned into stone fortresses. What was meant to crush resistance instead made it stronger. What followed was not a normal battle. It was a fight measured in meters. German soldiers were trained for fast, open warfare. Tanks, coordination, and overwhelming firepower were supposed to decide battles quickly. In Stalingrad, none of it worked. Tanks struggled to move through narrow streets. Artillery risked killing friendly troops. Airstrikes were too dangerous to use close to the front. Combat became close, violent, and personal. Soldiers fought room by room, floor by floor. Stairwells became ambush points. Basements turned into bunkers. A single building might change hands several times in one day. In some places, the front line ran straight through the middle of a room. The Soviets adapted quickly. They stayed as close as possible to German positions, so artillery and air power couldn't be used effectively. Snipers hunted officers. Small assault teams attacked at night. The Red Army understood one crucial thing. They did not need to defeat the Germans quickly. They only needed to make them bleed. Time itself became a weapon. Behind the Soviet defense was courage, but also fear. Stalin issued Order Number 227, known for its brutal words, "Not one step back." Retreat without orders could mean execution. Blocking units stood behind the lines to enforce discipline. It was ruthless, but it showed how desperate the situation had become. If Stalingrad fell, there would be little left to stop the Germans from pushing deeper into the Soviet heartland. On the German side, the situation was far worse than it looked on paper. The Sixth Army was fighting at the end of massive supply lines. Fuel shortages were constant. Food deliveries were delayed. Winter clothing was limited or missing entirely. But German command culture punished bad news. Officers who reported setbacks risked being ignored, replaced, or blamed. So reports were softened. Losses were downplayed. Progress was exaggerated. Hitler either believed these reports or chose to believe them. By autumn, German troops were exhausted. Casualties mounted daily. Still, the orders never changed. Attack again. Push forward. Take the city. The ruins became sacred ground that could not be abandoned. Entire divisions were destroyed for buildings that had no real military value. While the Germans poured everything into the city itself, Soviet commanders were thinking differently. They were not focused on Stalingrad alone. They were watching the flanks. In November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive aimed not at the city, but at the weaker Axis forces guarding the German sides. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units were under-equipped, overstretched, and poorly supplied. They collapsed almost immediately. Within days, Soviet forces met behind German lines. The trap snapped shut. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers were surrounded. This was the last real chance to save the Sixth Army. German generals begged for a breakout. The encirclement was still thin. Fuel was limited, but escape was possible. The army could withdraw and fight another day. Hitler said no. He declared Stalingrad a fortress and promised the army would be supplied by air. It sounded bold. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe lacked the transport planes. Winter storms grounded flights. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot many down. The supplies that arrived were nowhere near enough. Hunger spread. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies vanished. Wounded soldiers froze or bled to death. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and limbs. Morale collapsed. Units stopped functioning. Discipline broke down. Soldiers searched the ruins for food. Horses were slaughtered and eaten. Some men froze to death in their positions, too weak to move. Still, the orders were clear. Resist. By now, Hitler was no longer fighting the enemy. He was fighting reality. Admitting defeat at Stalingrad would shatter the image of invincibility he had built. So the army was sacrificed to protect that image. In January 1943, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The message was unmistakable. Paulus surrendered anyway. On February 2nd, 1943, the last German forces in Stalingrad laid down their weapons. Around 90,000 soldiers marched into captivity. Most would never return. Disease, starvation, and exposure killed the majority within months. Stalingrad destroyed more than an army. It shattered Axis morale. Allies lost faith in German leadership. Occupied nations saw proof that the Reich could be beaten. On the Eastern Front, the balance of power shifted forever. But the deepest lesson of Stalingrad is often ignored. The battle was not lost because German soldiers lacked bravery. It was lost because leaders refused to adapt, because retreat became forbidden, because ideology replaced strategy, and because truth never reached the top. Stalingrad proves that wars are decided not only by weapons and numbers, but by decisions and by the refusal to make them in time. Once that refusal sets in, defeat does not arrive all at once. It comes slowly, painfully, and one life at a time.